Hello, welcome again to RC-558 Special Topics in Rehabilitation. We're again talking about rural rehabilitation. In this class, we're specifically talking about the VR counselor interacting in the rural area. I'm David Beach, adjunct faculty at the graduate program in rehabilitation counseling at the University of Kentucky, and welcome again. In this week's class notes, you'll find the PowerPoint titled The VR Counselor in the Rural Setting, Challenges, Strategies, and Emerging Trends in Service Delivery. So please, again, have that available. Pull that up or print it off and have it. We're going to be reviewing that as we work through the lecture. As we've discussed, the rural population has it's unique and it has its own set of challenges, and it's important to understand as a service provider those challenges. And I hope that in my previous lectures I have not painted too grim a picture. There are many strengths of working in a rural area that and many experiences that you get to have as a rural counselor that you don't get to have in a metro or urban area. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to start with slide 2. We're going to talk about challenges. You know, while there are a lot of positives, still there are many challenges. We talked about that in the previous lectures where we discussed the health issues related to living in a rural area, the high rates of poverty, access to health care, lack of transportation, lack of adequate employment, lack of high-paying employment. We're going to get a little bit more specific in how this impacts the VR counselor in trying to do their job. First of all, on slide 2, talks about limited service providers. So just access to the people that can provide the services in terms of psychological services. Many times, not only are there not an adequate enough amount of psychological service providers, there aren't specialties. In an urban area, you may be able to find somebody that specifically treats or specializes in diagnoses like autism or children with disabilities or learning disabilities or ADHD. But in your more rural populations, you don't find that. So there's that, again, lack of access to specialty care, and to access that, you may have to drive quite a bit. So for somebody living in a rural area to access somebody providing specialized services in terms of psychological services, much of it's performed or it's conducted, fairly regularly, once a month, twice a month. It can be very expensive. So that's a significant issue, because without adequate psychological services, that's a big, almost a pillar of the VR process. And the person has to be physically stable, have to be psychologically stable to be able to participate in services. So if you don't have psychological services, and generally, in my experience, psychological services even lag behind the medical services, because medical services are generally more supported by medical insurance, where psychological services are not. So there's even more of a shortage of psychological services in rural areas. Assessment is also there's a shortage or limited service providers in rural areas, and there is such a high demand. What few persons out there doing psychological and vocational assessments, what's also I've looked down there at the bottom, there's such a small number of service providers that it's hard to get good quality in-depth assessment that can really give you good information on the individuals. and medical assessment as well, because the hospitals and the service providers just don't have the facilities to get that specialized treatment. Rural areas also have limited access to vocational training. They may not have larger state colleges, even private colleges, because of the lack of an economy or an adequate economy. You don't see the apprenticeships or short-term trainings out there. So persons can't, if you can't afford to go to college, if there's not a college or a training program locally, you'll have to travel somewhere else. If you have to travel somewhere else, you have to be able to afford it. If you do travel somewhere else, which is what happens in many rural areas, a lot of times you don't come back, which is why the rural population tends to be much older, because many of the younger, who we talked about previously, the highest number of unemployment are with minority groups and young adults. So young adults are going to go where the jobs are. If they move away, that leaves less young adults in the rural areas. So, and that's all linked because there aren't jobs and there aren't ways to be trained for jobs in rural areas. There is a lack of interpreting services. If you're a minority, good luck finding, it's not English speaking, good luck in finding a qualified interpreter. Also with American Sign Language, there's always difficulty finding persons that can provide that service as well. There are a lack of community rehabilitation providers. Those services, while they do exist in rural areas, a lot of times they have to cover very large areas, or they're very limited in the services they can provide because of many of the populational issues we've discussed prior. There's just not enough people to support the scope of practice that they really need to provide services. I think we've talked enough about how medical services are impacted. We've said before that there just aren't enough consumers of medical services to justify. There's not enough population to justify a lot of specialized services, and therefore they're usually around more urban areas. So if you need any specialized diagnostic testing, you have to go, or a specialized treatment, you have to travel to get there. Job placement, a lot of times, in your urban areas, they'll have agencies or CRPs that focus solely on job placement, and they can survive on the amount of placements or reimbursements they get from the local agencies. But when you get out in rural areas, there aren't as many job placement service providers, and it's also because there aren't as many open jobs to acquire as well. Talked a little bit already about vocational assessment. Generally, also support employment. There's much less access to support employment providers for many of the same reasons. There aren't enough jobs. There aren't enough consumers to be able to support the staff that you need. They have to cover very large areas, and it's very difficult to make that work out in terms of cost to benefit ratio or cost, profit margins. And specialized medicine, we said in a previous lecture that because there is not adequate specialized medicine, specialized medical care, general practitioners tend to provide most of the medical treatment or a lot of the medical treatment because individuals just don't have time to travel, or they don't have the resources to travel to access the specialized care. This is on slide 3. This is based on data, not just my opinion, but there's a problem, and there's been a long-term problem with a lack of adequate special education, especially in recruiting special education teachers in rural areas. So if you don't have good quality professionals providing special education, it's going to be difficult to prepare those children that are receiving their education and preparing them for transition into adulthood and further training and employment. In rural areas, because of the lack of population, generally counselors tend to cover larger territories and they have more counties. So they have to travel more, and if you have to cover more counties, that's an issue, because not only do you have to understand how one county works, you have to understand how more than one county works. And there's a lot, especially in a rural area like Kentucky, county government controls a lot of the business that goes around. So you have to understand how those county systems work and how to access resources and how to access information and how to access referral sources. So, not only do you have to do that, you have to spend a lot of time where you lose the opportunity to provide face-to-face services. It's instead spent driving in a car. If you have to drive 2 hours to a county and you work an 8-hour day, 2 hours there, 2 hours back, it's only 4 hours in a day that you have available. Actually 3.5 if you take a lunch, or 3 if you take an hour. Well, we'll say 3.5 that you have available to provide face-to-face services to persons with disabilities, or provide advocacy or resource development or any of those activities. So, if you're covering more territory, that's a lot less time you can provide face-to-face direct care. We've talked the high rate of immediate need, high poverty rates. What happens is they come to you and they may have nothing. They may be, 1 day, 1 week, 1 hour from homelessness. They may be hungry, and there just aren't enough services to help meet those needs, or they can't access them. Lack of adequate housing. They don't have a stable place to live. And as any good counselor knows, when their immediate needs are not met, if somebody is concerned about where they're going to lay their head down at night and where their next meal is going to come from, it's hard to get them talking about the future, the long-term future, what's best for their long-term future. They're worried about tonight, they're worried about tomorrow, they're worried about surviving the week. It's a little bit more, it can be a little bit more life or death, because there aren't that many other services they can access, and they come to VR with more of an expectation of immediate assistance. Another uniqueness or a troubling trend, and it appears to be getting worse, is there's a generational dependence on public support. And I've lost track. I think we're either on the 3rd generation of Social Security and welfare, or the 4th, or something like that. But what many families, they view public support as an entitlement, and because there's so many barriers to getting a job and to becoming more independent, that in many cases it's a lot more safe. Even though the amount of money they live on is very low, it's a lot more safe for them to just stay on receiving public benefits. So what happens is there's this great fear, not only of losing money, but those medical benefits. And if you have a physical or any type of disability, those medical benefits are critical in maintaining your health. So that is one issue. And because many times you'll find in households where there are multiple people in that household on public support, there's concern that if somebody goes and gets a job, they'll lose that guaranteed money, and because unemployment or employment, like anything else, can be here today and gone tomorrow, that person loses that Social Security or welfare check, and then gets a job and loses that paycheck, it may be a while before they can actually get back on public benefits. And so what we will see sometimes is is a lack of family support. They really don't want the child or their dependent or the family member to actually get a job and get off benefits. In the rural VR process, there's I list as a challenge, and it could be a strength too. There's a lot of importance of religion and family. If you have a supportive family, the person will have the ability to go farther. If there isn't support for some of the factors I talked about earlier, the person may not be as active in their program. Religion plays a role in that. That many may be very active in their church. The pastor is seen as a counsel to the family and a guide, sort of, and they can set the tone in their view of disability and an individual's ability to work because of their disability, can have a great influence on whether or not that person seeks to better themselves through employment. Cultural diversity, even in rural areas, we see the spread of various cultures, not only in your Hispanic and Black and those types of minorities, but even Appalachian, various subsets. That you have to have an understanding of each rural area has its own uniqueness, and they have their own ways that they interact and expectations, and the counselor must be privy or sensitive to those issues. Even in a state, and I'm sure this is similar in all the states, but in a state like Kentucky, there's a big difference in how people from a metro area like Louisville interact versus how people in Eastern Kentucky act. Their interactions are different. But you can even go to rural areas on the western part of the state, and their interactions and their culture is distinctly different. So you have to be very careful in understanding that can change from county to county. You can have a county that, on one side of the mountain, it may be very, they may be very conservative, and then you cross the mountain, and that group may be more liberal, more forward thinking. So you have to be sort of sensitive to that and understand how those areas developed and how those cultures developed, and be able to operate in that culture. Accessibility is always an issue. Many of these towns were built prior to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, 504. They were and definitely prior to the Americans with Disabilities Act. So many of their buildings were not built with, or their services or their just sidewalks and things like that were not built with the ADA in mind. So they've had to go back and retrofit, and in rural counties that have been shrinking, the tax base may or may not be there to support that. So, or this may be a closed-mindedness or a lost, that just they haven't had that opportunity to do so. So many times accessibility is an issue, and a lot of the buildings may be older and not have adequate elevators, and so it's generally physically there's a lot of accessibility issues. In terms of voting, that's one of the biggest complaints that we hear in rural areas, is that the voting sites are not accessible because many of the buildings were built back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So that's a major challenge for a person that's a wheelchair user or has some kind of physical limitation that impacts their mobility. There are reduced human services. There just aren't as many programs and agencies out there available to provide human services. One challenge that is out there is the mistrust of government. If you work for the public VR program and you're telling an individual, yes, if you get employed, you know, you won't lose all of your benefits. You know, if you make 30, it will reduce your, you know, you make 300, it'll reduce your benefits by maybe $200, and therefore you'll still be $100 to the good. They have a hard time believing that. There's a mistrust of anybody from the government. They have a very hard time viewing anybody related to the government as an ally. So a lot of times the counselor has to spend a lot of time on the front end of the counseling relationship, developing that trust. You have a small labor market, and many of the better paying jobs are physical and often causes the disability. When we worked in Eastern Kentucky, the big, well, it wasn't necessarily the biggest, but some of the higher paying jobs were in the coal mines, and people, you know, it was not uncommon for your beginning coal miner to make $40, $50, $60,000 a year, which was pretty good because it didn't require a high school diploma. Which that's not bad, except that's very physical work. And in fact, many of the people we worked with in our rehabilitation programs and workers' compensation were coal miners because the jobs were physical and had high rates of injury. And that the same goes with farming, manufacturing, food processing. So you know, a lot of those jobs that are out there are more referral sources than employment opportunities. You get into what we call, you know, Walmart in your school system are your biggest employers. So you have to develop those relationships. Your school systems have a diverse human resource needs, and so do Walmart. The problem is with Walmart is they generally don't pay a lot. They don't have a lot of full-time workers. But because they exist, they drove a lot of your smaller shops out of business. They might have paid a little better, might have had benefits, might have had full-time workers. So generally, you know, school system jobs in rural areas or county jobs, government jobs are your more sought after jobs, which is not necessarily the case when you move into more metro areas. There's a lack of public accessible transportation, lack of personal attendant care, or personal attendant programs. Counselors lose that ability to be portable in their technology. You know, you just don't find Wi-Fi at every county or every town. Even cell phone, you know, many of those laptops have cell phone usage. If the network supports it, you can have little cell phone cards, the network cards. But those you know, when you work in rural areas, a lot of times the cell phone service isn't adequate enough to support that technology, so you can't access your case files electronically. So you have to paper carry everything, or you know, you don't have information at your fingertips that you may need. Another issue is limited training opportunities for counselors. That counselors, because they're not as close to your larger training, your central offices or your universities or your training sites, they can't just access training very easily, at least face-to-face training, and also they have limited interaction with the agency leadership because they are generally pretty far removed from the central offices, which are usually located in the capitals, which are generally metro or in a fairly metro area. They're removed, so agency leadership, doesn't get down there very often. Supervisors, just like counselors, have bigger areas to cover, therefore they get less face-to-face time. So you can see that the counselor has a lot of issues that they have to address. But and I don't have a slide for this, but there are also some strengths to working in rural areas. Once you engender the trust of the population, then they're very loyal. They tend to be. They're very appreciative of the services they receive. Sometimes it creates good referral sources. It creates good networking. There's a lot of work ethic and a lot of appreciation and a lot of honesty in rural areas. But there are a lot of challenges they have to come. Some strategies that we've developed, and these are kind of a combination from various sources to address rural challenges. And on page 6, slide 6, we talk about partnerships. It's important in today's time, and I'm sure you started to see it in a lot of your classes. No one program can go it alone anymore. We just simply don't have the resources. We have to work with other agencies to pool our resources and develop those partnerships so that people can get the various resources that they need to get them to a point where they are more independent and are employed. The partnerships that I listed here, you can see them. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll hit some of the highlights. It's important that you develop a relationship with local community and technical college. Not only can they usually provide you access to initial training, college preparatory training, those first 2 years of associate's degree, but a lot of times they have partnerships with larger universities and they can access bachelor's degrees, sometimes even higher. But they often have workforce training initiatives, specialized trainings for job needs or employment needs out that are specific to that labor market. Workforce partners, we are all familiar with the One Stop and the Workforce Investment Act. We have mandatory partners. It's important we work with those to pool our resources. Working with your employment agencies to link the job openings with and make sure our consumers have access to that. Social Security, so you can get adequate information related to the impact of income and work on benefits. Human service agencies, hospitals and rehab centers, just so that you can access their services and get referrals. Churches, as I said earlier, religion plays a big part in many rural areas, and but churches also provide more and more social human services, food pantries, clothes closets. You're starting to see in the past 10 years the development of employment programs in churches and more organized human service efforts, and accessing those can really help, especially when the consumer comes in with some immediate need. You can see area development districts. Those are more regional areas that look at the labor market and trying to develop that understanding, making sure that those area development districts take into account people with disabilities. Local county government, making sure that you work with them so that they understand your services and take into account persons with disabilities. regional mental health centers, local charitable organizations, community rehab centers, transportation providers, unions. Many union programs have apprenticeship programs, and they have the same requirements as far as the ADA. Banks. Many people don't know this, but banks have service requirements in terms of part of the FDIC requirements is that they use so much, spend so much per year, a portion of the year on charities and supporting the community. And a lot of times they're great to work with your with advocacy efforts and work on visioning teams and boards, etc. Independent living centers that provide services in rural areas, a great resource. Agricultural extension services, people often forget about that, but they offer a wealth of information related to, home economics and budget making and just a lot of independent living training that we don't even think about. Public libraries. If you don't have access to technology, where can you go? You go to a public library. Okay, because of time, we're going to wrap this up and I'm going to split this lecture into 2 lectures. So we're going to continue on page 8 because for technology reasons, we're going to split the video right here. So please go immediately and we will finish this lecture up in part 2. Thank you.